It begins in the early morning mist. A ring of stones encircles the grass. Men arrive from every direction, on horseback, on foot, with axes at their belts, but no blood in their eyes. They are not here to raid or conquer. They have come to argue, not with fists. Not today. Each man finds his place, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the open sky. There is no throne, no king, no one barking orders. But when the law speaker steps into the center and raises his hand, the circle stills. The silence is ancient, worn into the soil. This is the thing, and here, in this raw northern air, justice is spoken aloud, remembered word by word, judged by the voices of free men. And surprisingly, it works. No written laws, no prisons, no royal judges, just memory, reputation, and the belief that even in a brutal world, fairness could still be carved out like runes into stone. In a society so often painted with blood and flame, this corner of Viking life whispers something different, something strange, something democratic. Strange, isn't it? In the age of axes and longships, where men drowned their enemies and set villages ablaze, they still gathered in peace to settle land disputes, punish wrongdoers, and decide the rules of life itself. It's not a myth. The most savage warriors of the North built their world not just on strength, but on law, and that's exactly where this journey begins. Subscribe to the video, sharing channel to join the rest of this saga. There's much more hidden in the fog of Viking justice. The thing was not a building, it was an event, an institution, a living ritual where law walked without walls. Local gatherings took place all across Scandinavia, from the small by-gathing in farming villages to the great regional assemblies like the Gulating in Norway. Every freeman had the right to attend, speak, and vote. There were no golden chairs, only stones to sit on and voices to carry arguments through cold wind. And the law? It was not written. It lived inside the law speaker, an elected elder trained from youth to memorize thousands of lines of legal tradition. A walking library. His voice carried the authority of a book long before books could survive a Viking winter. Decisions were made by consensus or by majority, depending on the region. It wasn't always clean. Sometimes debates turned to shouts. Occasionally, knives flashed. But the principle held. The law must be spoken, not screamed, heard, not forced, remembered, not forgotten. Land disputes were common. So were inheritance, fights. But unlike many medieval courts elsewhere, Viking law often considered local knowledge more valuable than titles or money. If a neighbor said a field had belonged to one family for 3 generations, that mattered. A man's reputation, his drinkscaper, was weighed like gold, and justice could be odd. In one known case, a farmer accused his neighbor of stealing a sheep and eating it. The accused claimed the sheep died of disease. The court? They asked for the bones. When the bones looked scorched, the accused said lightning had struck the sheep. The assembly, unimpressed, fined him 2 ounces of silver and demanded he share meat next time. It wasn't all fairness and fresh air. Women, slaves, and foreigners had little or no say at some gatherings, and sometimes verdicts depended more on power than truth. But still, compared to the rest of medieval Europe, the Viking thing was astonishingly open, and it was resilient. Even after kings rose and Christianity spread, the thing remained. In Iceland, it evolved into the Althing. the world's oldest continuous parliament, still functioning in some form today. Yet back in those early centuries, beneath pine trees and under cloudy skies, Viking justice lived in breath and memory. In the idea that law should not be locked in stone towers, but spoken where the wind could hear. And in a world sharpened by blade and bone, that idea was nothing short of radical. The law speaker stands in the center again, his voice steady, his words ancient. No parchment, no ink. Every rule, every penalty, every right etched into his mind since youth. If he forgets, the law disappears. And so he remembers. In early Viking society, law was not written, it was recited. Passed down orally from generation to generation, preserved like sacred songs. The law speaker, or skumare, wasn't merely a figurehead. He was the guardian of justice, the one who kept the fragile threads of order from unraveling. Elected for terms that could last 3 years or more, the law speaker would stand at the center of the thing and speak aloud every law relevant to the session. Imagine the pressure. Misremember a detail, and someone might lose a farm or a life. It wasn't just dry legalese. The law speaker had to be a performer in a sense. Clear diction, firm tone, deep knowledge. His words could hush a crowd of rowdy warriors, many of whom had likely spent the night drinking mead or sharpening axes. And still, they listened. This man's memory was a weapon and a shield. In some parts of Scandinavia, like Iceland, the law speaker stood atop the Lagberg, the law rock, an actual stone platform, where his voice could carry over the gathered assembly. No megaphones. Just lungs, discipline, and repetition. What's more peculiar is that laws could only be spoken during the legal season, typically during the summer. For the rest of the year, justice waited. Odd, isn't it? In the land of ice and war, law had a season. Some argue this kept the process sacred. Others say it allowed emotions to cool, giving space between vengeance and verdict. Historians still debate whether this delay helped reduce violence or simply gave it more time to fester. The laws themselves often relied on poetic structure and rhythm to help with memorization. Legal phrases sounded like chants. Some began with phrases such as, "If a man takes another man's ox," and continued in structured stanzas. And this wasn't just a Scandinavian quirk. Other oral cultures developed similar systems, but the Viking world took it to a rare scale. In fact, it worked so well that even after literacy spread, the position of law speaker didn't vanish overnight. It adapted. Iceland retained its law speaker role for over 2 centuries after the arrival of written law codes. In some cases, there were even dueling law speakers when local assemblies couldn't agree who had the better memory or truer knowledge of precedent. These disagreements could delay court decisions by months. One famous case in Norway ended with both speakers being fined for wasting everyone's time. But there was danger too. If a law speaker became corrupt or simply lazy, the whole legal framework could be distorted. One slip and a precedent might vanish forever. One bias and a man's family line could lose its land. That's why communities took their choice seriously. A good law speaker was worth more than a dozen warriors. His words carried not just weight but survival. Imagine the silence when he stepped forward. Imagine hundreds of hardened men standing still to hear the outcome of a land feud, or whether a marriage was valid, or who had the right to collect seaweed from a certain stretch of beach. Not kings, not priests, Just memory. But memory, in this world, was law. Easy to imagine the Viking world as chaos and steel, raids and revenge. But behind that image stands this strange institution. Legal system balanced on a single human voice, and perhaps the most fascinating part. Sometimes, when no law speaker was available, or when distant settlements couldn't reach a formal thing, the oldest man in the village was chosen to recite what he believed the law to be. That's right, community elders could make rulings based not on written law, but on cultural memory and local precedent. Was it perfect? Hardly. But in a cold, scattered world, it was something. And often, that something kept swords sheathed and families fed. In the Viking imagination, the law wasn't a scroll or a statue, it was a story. And like all stories, it lived best when told aloud, again and again, beneath the wind. The air is thick with tension. Two men stand at opposite ends of the assembly, refusing to look one another in the eye. Their voices have grown hoarse with shouting, and no verdict has settled the dispute. The court murmurs. The law speaker nods. The gods must decide. The crowd parts. Trial by ordeal. In the Viking world, when evidence failed and witnesses swore conflicting oaths, there was a final, chilling option. Let the divine choose the victor. It was called ordeal, a test not of guilt or innocence, but of fate. Boiling water. Red-hot iron, sometimes a duel. If a man could endure pain and come out clean, then clearly the gods stood on his side. One common ordeal involved plunging a hand into scalding water to retrieve a stone. The arm was bandaged and sealed. 3 days later, the wound was inspected. If it festered, guilt. If it healed clean, innocence. There were no illusions. Everyone knew it wasn't fair. But when the law couldn't decide, it fell to the unknown. A darker version used glowing hot iron bars. A man had to carry one a certain distance. Again, the wound was wrapped and judged later. The scars told the story. Or at least, that was the idea. Sometimes a champion could be chosen to undergo the ordeal in place of the accused, a brother, a friend, a hired warrior. In one bizarre case, a farmer paid a berserker to undergo trial for him, and the berserker passed. The farmer was cleared. The berserker, later, went on to burn the farmer's bond for non-payment. Justice, in this world, wasn't neat, but it had structure. Even chaos had rules. Historians still debate whether these ordeals were intended to be truly divine tests or simply tools to pressure confessions. Some suggest the wounds were rigged, that sympathetic priests or healers treated the burns secretly to ensure healing. Others believe the wounds didn't matter as much as public perception. If a man looked strong, if he acted innocent, maybe he was. There's a strange honor in it all. For a culture so steeped in strength, it wasn't always about brute force. There were rules. Even pain had a process. Trial by ordeal wasn't used casually. It was usually reserved for serious crimes, murder, theft of sacred property, betrayal of kin. And only when all else failed. But it was never just about one man's fate. The community watched. A verdict wasn't just a resolution. It was a performance, a public reckoning. And sometimes, those watching weren't just judging the accused. They were thinking about their own chances. Should the gods ever call them forward, the ordeal didn't always end in scars. In some cases, a ritual duel, a holmgang, was offered instead. But more on that later. What stands out is this: in a time without prisons, without police, justice had to be felt. It had to leave a mark. Punishment had to be remembered. Not just by the one who suffered, but by everyone who saw it. One odd case from the far north involved a man accused of stealing a ship. He was offered ordeal, but instead demanded to face the accuser in a foot race around the fjord. The court, amused, agreed. The accused won and claimed innocence by divine favor. Whether that was legally valid is unclear. But the assembly let him go. Law in this world sometimes bent toward story more than logic. And yet, these ordeals were not endless. As Christianity spread, the church began to frown upon such pagan trials. New laws emerged. Holy relics replaced. Boiling water. Clergy interfered. Slowly, ordeal lost its edge. But in the early Viking Age, when the law had no book and no bailiff, and when oaths could be bought or forged, the ordeal stood like a last door at the edge of reason. And behind that door, fire. No sword, no noose, no iron collar, just a single word that changed everything. Outlaw. In the Viking world, death was not always the harshest punishment. Sometimes the worst fate was being unmade, cut off from society, stripped of all protection. To be outlawed was to be erased while still breathing. It meant no one could shelter, feed, or speak to the condemned. No one could offer help. Not even family. And anyone could kill the outlaw without consequence. It wasn't exile. It was erasure. Viking law had two levels of outlawry. The first, lesser outlawry, lasted 3 years. The second, full outlawry, was for life. Both were terrifying in a world where survival depended on community. Men sentenced to outlawry often didn't last long. With no place to hide and every hand against them, many fled into forests or distant islands, surviving like ghosts. Some tried to live off the land. Others died by ambush. A few, desperate, tried to sneak back into society, but the law made no exceptions. Even their names could be struck from family records. Historians still debate whether outlawry was always enforced with such cruelty, or if in some regions it became more symbolic, a legal fiction more than a death sentence. But in the sagas, outlaws lived like hunted beasts, chased by shadows and betrayed by kin. One peculiar case tells of an outlaw who disguised himself as a wandering poet and re-entered society under a false name. For 3 years, he composed praise songs for the very chieftain who had sentenced him. Only on the eve of the outlaw's pardon did he reveal himself. The chieftain laughed and gave him a silver ring. Justice wasn't always rigid, but it was. Always remembered. The reasons for outlawry varied. Murder without settlement, theft from a temple, violation of hospitality. But sometimes the line between crime and misfortune blurred. A man who accidentally killed another in a drunken brawl might be sentenced as severely as a cold-blooded killer, because Viking justice didn't just punish action, it punished disruption. Society relied on balance. A death disturbed that. If blood money wasn't paid, if reconciliation failed, then order had to be restored another way. Outlawry was that way, and it was public. Very public. At the thing, when outlawry was declared, the accused stood surrounded by neighbors, cousins, rivals. The law speaker called the name 3 times, loudly, then the sentence. And from that moment, The condemned was no longer under the law's protection. Not even burial rights were guaranteed. In one grim tale, a man sentenced to full outlawry was hunted for weeks through the mountains. When finally cornered, he offered his killer a silver brooch in exchange for a proper burial. The killer agreed, but buried him standing up, facing north, so he wouldn't find his way to Valhalla. A joke, cruel as winter, and yet there were outlaws who lived. Some became legends, forest dwellers, bandit kings, men who carved lives from the edge of civilization. One man, Grettir the Strong, lasted nearly 2 decades as an outlaw, battling ghosts, wild beasts, and bounty hunters before finally falling in a moonlit ambush. Even today, Grettir's Cave is a tourist site. Outlawry wasn't just a punishment. It was a story waiting to happen. A final chapter written in exile. But make no mistake, to be outlawed was to be unguarded. The law no longer cared what happened. Whether a man froze, starved, or was torn apart by wolves, it was no longer society's concern. It was the oldest kind of justice, cold, silent, and final. The wind catches her cloak as she steps forward, eyes fixed, voice clear. The men shift uncomfortably. They didn't expect her to speak, but she does. And no one dares interrupt. Viking women, long thought voiceless in a world of blades and beards, held more legal power than many realize. They could not vote at the thing. They couldn't be law speakers or join legal duels. But in matters of family, property, and marriage, their voices echoed through the courts. In fact, in cases of inheritance, divorce, and even murder within the household, a woman's testimony could tip the scales of justice. One famous example, a woman named the Deep-Minded. After her husband's death, she sailed to Iceland with her clan, claimed land, and distributed it legally among her family, acting fully within her rights under Viking law. No man challenged her claim, and yet women's power in court was often subtle. It came through influence, memory, and strategy. If a woman accused a man of violating a marriage contract or stealing her inheritance, she had the right to bring witnesses and demand judgment. Some women were so legally savvy they became known for drafting their own contracts, especially regarding dowries and land rights. One odd case from 10th century Norway involves a woman who accused her brother of hiding her share of inherited sheep. The court found in her favor not because of emotion, but because she could recite the exact grazing routes their father had used. Precision mattered more than passion, but the law wasn't fair in all corners. Women could not initiate certain types of lawsuits, especially those involving public violence. They could not challenge outlawry decisions, and if caught in adultery, their punishment was often harsher than a man's. A wife caught cheating might lose all property and face exile. A husband? A small fine maybe. Historians still debate whether these differences reflected practical concerns or simply male control. Some argue the system gave women unique spaces to wield authority. Others say the power was an illusion, limited and tolerated only when convenient. And yet, Viking sagas are full of clever, fierce women who understood the law and used it. Gudrun, Osvif's daughter, a central figure in the Laxdæla saga, manipulates legal and social customs to navigate 4 marriages, political feuds, and even revenge killings, all without ever lifting a weapon. She plays the courtroom like a harp, even in marriage. Viking women had rights many medieval women elsewhere lacked. They could initiate divorce, If a husband beat his wife or failed to support her, she could leave and take her dowry with her. She could remarry. She could own land. Divorce cases were settled in the thing, often with witnesses from both sides. One 11th century Icelandic record shows a woman standing in court, declaring her marriage void by stating 3 times in front of witnesses, "I divorce you." Simple, final, legal. It wasn't empowerment in the modern sense, but it was far from helplessness. And when women couldn't act directly, they influenced through sons, husbands, brothers. A whispered word at home could shift entire verdicts in the field. Some wives became their husbands' legal advisors, helping draft agreements and settle debts. Even among slaves, female voices could carry weight. Some concubines sued for freedom. After bearing a landowner's child, citing verbal promises or witnessed agreements. A few even succeeded. One curious case tells of a woman who, upon being denied her promised dowry sheep, released them into the woods and declared them free as her promises. The man sued for theft. The court sided with her, claiming the sheep, now wild, were beyond his claim. A joke, yes, but a legal joke. The Viking world didn't offer women full equality, but it gave them space, room to argue, tools to defend what was theirs, and that space was carved in lawn, not mercy. So when the wind lifts her cloak, and she steps into the circle of men, it's not just a moment of courage, it's a legal act, a social ripple, a whisper that in this harsh, cold world, voices carried farther than expected if they knew what to say. 2 men stare each other down, faces stiff with hatred, hands twitching toward the hilts at their sides. The assembly watches in silence. The verdict has been delivered, but neither side will accept it. The law has failed. Now, only blood will speak. In Viking society, justice was supposed to preserve peace. But when it broke down, when compensation was refused, or a ruling rejected, feud stepped in. Controlled vengeance, wrapped in honor and law. Killing wasn't always a crime. Sometimes it was a duty. When a family member was murdered and the fendi killer did not pay Wergeld, the required compensation, then vengeance became lawful. The family could track down the killer and exact blood revenge. As long as it followed the rules, it wasn't murder. It was justice. Feuds could last generations, and unlike courtroom verdicts, they didn't end with one death. The killing of a father could spark the killing of a brother, then a cousin, and so on. Entire families were wiped out this way, leaving only stories behind. One notorious feud from 10th century Iceland involved the families of Njal Lorgerson and Flosi Horgarson. After a failed court case and a dishonorable insult, the feud spiraled into arson, murder, and 30 deaths. The saga that tells their story, Njal's Saga, is a brutal, beautiful lesson in how law and honor could tangle into tragedy. And yet, even blood feuds had boundaries. There were limits on where revenge could occur. Killing a man in church? Forbiddance. Striking during a thing? Illegal. Taking revenge while a truce was active? A crime. Violators could themselves be outlawed. In other words, even chaos had paperwork. Historians still debate whether feuds were a failure of the system or part of it. Some argue they acted like pressure valves, brutal, yes, but necessary in a world without police. Others claim they reflected law's limits, showing what happened when people lost faith in fairness. Either way, the feud wasn't just emotional. It was cultural. It was structured. Before vengeance, messengers were often sent to declare intent. This gave the other side a chance to settle. If they refused, the blood began to flow, and once started, it was hard to stop. Some communities created peace councils to intervene in long feuds. These councils offered alternative compensation, new marriages, or shared sacrifices to restore balance. Sometimes it worked, sometimes not. One peculiar case tells of two families locked in feud after a hunting accident. The victim's brother declared vengeance, but before acting, he was given a hunting dog from the killer's estate, a legendary hound said to never lose a trail. The brother accepted the gift and called the feud settled by the gods. Whether the story's true is unclear, but the hound appears in several poems. It may have saved more lives than many swords. The deeper truth is this: Viking law didn't expect people to forgive easily. It assumed emotion. It allowed for it, but it tried often clumsily to channel it. Wurgeld was central to this effort. The payment for killing someone wasn't just money. It was a statement, a number placed on life not to diminish it, but to settle it. The amount varied by status. Killing a free man cost more than a slave. Killing a chieftain cost more than a farmer. Killing a child or a woman carried different values depending on region and time. And if the killer couldn't pay, the family might offer livestock, weapons, or even land. But if they offered nothing, then justice passed into steel. The irony? In a culture famous for raids and carnage, internal killing was taken very seriously. Unjustified violence was deeply shameful. A man who killed without legal cause could be stripped of land, honor, and kin. That's why some tried everything to avoid feud. They made elaborate settlements, public oaths, long negotiations. Some even used marriage to heal wounds, offering a daughter in marriage to the victim's son as a living peace treaty. Others simply vanished, fled into the wild, hoping the winds would erase their crime. But the law remembered. Even if the people didn't, the law speaker might. At the next thing, the case could be raised again. The feud revived. So the next time two men stood across from each other, hands twitching at their sides, the assembly watched more than just the swords. They watched the law, the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the blade could stay sheathed one more day. A man dies, his sons gather. The land he tilled, the tools he owned, even the fishing net hung over the rafters, now all must be divided, but not by whim, not by emotion. By law. Viking society may seem built on muscle and battle cries, but underneath it all ran a quiet, powerful network of rules governing property, especially inheritance. Land passed not to the loudest voice, but to the rightful heir, and there were rules. Lots of them. When a man died, his estate didn't vanish. It passed to his kin in a careful order. Sons first, then daughters, then siblings. If no direct family remained, the clan, the extended network of blood relatives, stepped in. And if no heir at all could be found, the land returned to the local thing, where it was redistributed to the community. This wasn't guesswork. Viking law laid out exact lines of succession. Even in regions where law remained unwritten, these customs were known by heart, especially by older women who often acted as walking family trees. Oddly enough, daughters could inherit land too, though often only in the absence of brothers. In some areas, they were granted a half share compared to male heirs. In others, daughters could inherit equal portions of movable property, like livestock or silver, but not the farm itself. Historians still debate whether these differences reflected economic logic or pure patriarchy. But one thing is clear: women weren't cut out of the equation entirely. They had stakes, and they defended them. One strange case from Iceland tells of a man who tried to disinherit his daughter by claiming she was the child of a forest spirit. She challenged the claim at the thing, presenting the midwife who had attended her birth. The court ruled in her favor and fined the father for false testimony. Justice with a wink. Property wasn't just about land. It included boats, livestock, weapons, and even access rights like fishing spots or mountain pastures. These weren't casual privileges. They were legally protected. A man who fished in another's stream could be fined or worse, and it all had to be recorded, not on paper, but in memory and community knowledge. That's why inheritance disputes often turned into courtroom drama. Everyone knew the stakes. Everyone remembered who had helped who during a famine, who had fought beside whom in battle, who had married whose cousin. Reputation became evidence, and the will of the dead? Sometimes that helped. If a dying man made a final declaration in front of witnesses, it could override traditional inheritance lines if the witnesses were deemed trustworthy. But not always. One curious tale involves a dying chieftain who, surrounded by kin, named his favorite horse as his heir. The thing ruled the horse could not own land, but allowed the chieftain's estate to fund a burial mound large enough to house both man and animal. A joke, a warning, or just grief? No one knows. But the mound still stands. Disputes over property could turn violent. A cousin denied his share might challenge the ruling in court or with sword. That's why clear agreements mattered. Viking law encouraged formal contracts, even if unwritten. A handshake witnessed by others, an exchange of gifts, a spoken oath. These were binding. Break them, and the consequences could be severe. Sometimes, property inheritance served as peacekeeping. A man might divide his estate while still alive, gifting land early to avoid future fights. Others created foster arrangements, sending sons to be raised by allies, then granting them land as part of the bond. Fosterage was more than childcare. It was legal alliance. But when things went wrong, they went very wrong. In one saga, two brothers argued over a single field. One claimed it had been gifted by their father on his deathbed. The other claimed it had never left the family estate. The thing could not decide. The brothers fought. One died. The survivor was outlawed, and the field lay abandoned for years. Nobody won. Except maybe the grass. Through it all, the law tried to hold order, to stop the wild tide of grief, greed, and memory from washing everything away. It didn't always succeed. But the effort, the rules, the recitations, the stone-ringed gatherings showed something remarkable. In a world of storms, the Vikings tried to build fences, legal ones, to protect what mattered and to pass it on. The man stands before the thing, shoulders bare, eyes lowered. His wrists are thick with rope scars, his clothes simple, worn. He does not speak unless spoken to. He is a thrall, a slave. But even here, in this frozen corner of the world, the law gives him something. Viking slavery, though brutal and widespread, had rules. A strange legal gray zone. Slaves were considered property, but not entirely. In some regions, they could be fined for crimes. In others, they could testify in court if tortured first. Dark, yes. But still within boundaries, slaves could not attend the thing. They had no vote, no right to own land, no freedom to marry. And yet, some could buy their freedom. Others were freed in their master's will. A few even became landowners. Historians still debate whether Viking slavery was harsher than that of Rome or more flexible than that of medieval Europe. What makes it stranger is the quiet door the law left open. A freedman, a former slave, had limited rights at first. He could not hold public office. His children were free, but his name was always tied to his former master. And yet, 3 generations after manumission, a family was considered fully free. Clean slate. The law remembered, but it could also forgive. One peculiar story tells of a woman named Skjaldvar, born a thrall but freed in her teens. She worked in a household for years, saved enough to buy a cow, then traded that cow for a small plot of land. Decades later, she sued a neighbor for damaging her fence and won. Her name appears in 3 separate legal records. A thrall turned. Litigant. Small miracles in the cold. Slave markets operated in coastal towns. Dublin, York, Hidibi. People captured in raids, Franks, Slavs, Saxons, were bought and sold like cargo. Some were branded. Others were traded for tools, cloth, or even beer. But inside the Scandinavian homeland, the situation was layered. Some thralls were born into servitude. Others were criminals who had sold themselves to avoid outlawry. And some, remarkably, chose servitude, short-term slavery, as a form of debt repayment. It offered food, shelter, and a strange kind of legal protection, because a master was responsible for the crimes of his slaves. If a thrall stole or murdered, the master paid the fine or suffered the punishment. This gave landowners strong incentive to manage their household honorably, or at least carefully. One saga recounts a master who was forced to pay for a thrall who burned down a storage shed in a drunken rage. The master then turned around and sued the man who sold him the thrall, claiming he'd purchased faulty property. The case ended in a fine and a clause banning that seller from market for 5 years. Legal comedy, Viking-style. It wasn't justice in the modern sense, but it was a structure, a way to assign blame, prevent chaos, and keep society from unraveling under its own contradictions. Some freed slaves even took up arms. A few joined raiding crews. One man, once a thrall in Norway, became the quartermaster of a longship. He kept the books, made shore deals, and eventually retired with enough silver to sponsor a local thing feast. When he died, the law speaker included his name in the roll of those who had given gifts to law. Still, not all were lucky. Most thralls lived and died in silence, their stories lost to the fields and hearths where they worked. The law noticed them only when necessary, when something was broken, or when someone had to pay. And yet, the very fact that they appeared in the law at all recorded, measured, debated says something unusual, that even in the shadows of Viking society, even among those at the bottom, the cold eye of the thing sometimes turned and blinked. A hush falls over the assembly. 2 men step forward, weapons drawn not in rage, but in agreement. The duel has been sanctioned. It is not murder. It is not chaos. It is a HOLMGANG trial by combat, but not the frenzied brawls of taverns or ambushes in the dark. This is ritual. This is law. And both men know the rules. In the Viking world, when oaths clashed and evidence ran thin, the holmgang offered one last path to justice. It was, in effect, a legal duel, structured, limited, and sometimes shockingly civil. The name holmgang comes from holm, meaning a small islet or flat area where such fights took place. Duels were often arranged in advance, sometimes with the aid of witnesses. A formal challenge was issued. The accused could accept or refuse. Refusal, in many cases, meant forfeiting the case, and yet many accepted. Not for honor alone, but because winning a holmgang could settle legal disputes, secure land claims, or erase accusations. It wasn't just about strength. It was about proving the gods or fate were on one side. Combat followed strict rules. The duel space was marked, often a square of cloaks or stones. Each fighter could bring a shield, sword, and in some traditions, a second like a referee. Blows were exchanged in turns. If a man's shield was broken, he could ask for another, usually up to 3. First blood sometimes ended the duel. In other cases, it continued until submission or death. But there was procedure. One peculiar story from the sagas tells of a man who showed up to a holmgang with a sausage tied to his sword, declaring he had no wish to kill, only to amuse the gods. The court fined him for disrespect, but he won the case. His opponent never landed a blow. Historians still debate whether holmgangs were truly legal institutions or theatrical forms of deterrence. Some believe they were tools of intimidation, a way for powerful men to cow their rivals. Others argue they were sincere, and that in a world without fingerprints or paper records, the body itself became evidence. It's hard to say. Records vary across regions. In Norway and Denmark, holmgangs were common until outlawed in the 11th century. Iceland, too, used them frequently until the Althing ruled against the practice after several fatal outcomes. Too many swords. Not enough mercy. And yet, before their decline, holmgangs were taken seriously. They were not optional entertainment. They were court-approved resolutions. Losing didn't just mean bruises. It meant forfeiting land, status, or legal claims. But not everyone could participate. Women were generally barred, though one saga recounts a female warrior named Hervor, who challenged a man to a holmgang and won, securing her father's sword in the process. The case was recorded with admiration and unease. Some duels were between slaves, others between chieftains. But the most common were among landowners, men with something to gain or lose. And the community watched carefully. Victory brought legal weight. Defeat brought shame and consequences. Duels didn't always end in death. Sometimes a fighter yielded. Sometimes his second stepped in to call a halt. And in rare cases, both fighters agreed mid-fight to split the disputed property and end the matter peacefully. Those were the exceptions. One grim tale tells of a man who lost 3 duels in one summer. After the third, he was declared legally cursed, unlucky, and untrustworthy. No one would trade with him. He died that winter, frozen outside a feast hall. The sword didn't kill him. Reputation did, and that's what made holmgangs so strange. They weren't just violence, they were visibility. Public tests of fate and character, witnessed by neighbors, remembered for generations, Sometimes the duel was unnecessary. The threat of it alone could lead to settlement. One man, challenged to a holmgang, invited his opponent to dinner instead. They ate, drank, then quietly negotiated a land division. When asked why he backed down, the challenger said, "Steel forgets. The stomach remembers," a joke, but a true one. In time, as Christianity grew and kings gained power, holmgangs were seen as pagan relics, dangerous, primitive, unchristian. Laws were passed. The fights ended, but for centuries, when words failed and the law grew thin, the Vikings trusted something older, something colder. 2 men, 2 swords, 1 answer. The boat rocks gently in the harbor. A man steps off, carrying goods wrapped in sealskin. He's come from across the sea with grain, fish oil, stories, and questions, because where Viking swords once cut paths through kingdoms, Viking law now follows. It wasn't just local. It traveled across the scattered islands, deep fjords, and winding rivers of Scandinavia. A network of thing assemblies rose like lighthouses, each with its own customs, yet bound by common threads. And where the Norse settled, their legal traditions took root. In Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and the Faroe Islands, the legal landscape was shared but never identical. Each region shaped its own flavor of justice. But the similarities, the bones of Viking law, are deep. One of the most extraordinary examples is the Althing of Iceland. Founded around 930 AD. It became the largest and most structured legal assembly in the Viking world. Held each summer at Lyngvellir, a dramatic rift valley surrounded by lava rock and waterfalls, it gathered chieftains, farmers, traders, even bards. Not for war, but for words. The law speaker stood atop the law rock and recited 1/3 of the law each year, so the full body of law would be heard over 3 summers. Legal booths dotted the fields. Temporary camps sprang up like markets. Some came to argue cases, others came to trade goods or gossip. The atmosphere was part trial, part festival, and oddly enough, part courtship fair. In the middle of a legal gathering, young people met, marriages were arranged, debts settled in the shade of tents. Justice mingled with sausage stalls. The law, it seems, was also a social network, but the Althing was more than just a regional fair. It had real power. Disputes were heard by panels of chieftains, and decisions, though not always enforced by a centralized force, carried weight. Enforcement fell to the community, to honor, to threat of outlawry or feud. But rulings were remembered. They mattered. One strange case involved a man accused of stealing a neighbor's horse by trading places with it in the night. The thief rode off with the stolen horse and left his own in its stall, hoping no one would notice. The court ruled it wasn't theft because technically he had left a horse, but he was fined anyway for being too clever. Historians still debate whether this reflects real flexibility in the law or whether it's simply a saga writer's joke. Either way, the verdict stuck. In Sweden, the ting assemblies operated similarly, though with more centralized royal involvement. Kings sent envoys to oversee court decisions. Even so, local leaders often held sway. The king might rule in theory, but the farmer's word in court could still carry more weight than the crown's. Norway, too, had regional things. The Frostating, Gulating, and Eidsivating formed a triad of medieval legislative centers, each collecting laws into codes that would later influence Norwegian governance for centuries. These gatherings weren't just for the elite free men from the region could attend, vote, speak. One curious tradition from the Gulating required each free household to send one representative. But to avoid the chaos of overcrowding, anyone who brought more than one companion had to pay extra in beer, a mild deterrent, or a sly fundraiser. Even Viking colonies adopted their own legal systems. In Greenland, settlers imported the Althing model. Though smaller in scale, the court at Bratalia served as both legal and spiritual anchor for the icy colony. Records show disputes over sheep grazing, seal hunting rights, and who had the right to fish in particular fjords. And despite isolation, Greenlandic courts kept remarkably close ties to Icelandic law. Letters traveled back and forth, sometimes by ship, sometimes stitched into cloaks carrying decisions, verdicts, and questions for the mother assembly. The Viking diaspora wasn't just swords and sagas. It was scrolls of law spoken, remembered, enforced. The idea of a portable legal tradition wasn't unique to the Norse, but theirs was uniquely oral, uniquely flexible. They built their legal systems the way they built ships, strong, adaptable, and seaworthy. One last detail stands out. Many of these assemblies, althing, ulating, frostating, didn't disappear. They evolved. Some became the backbone of modern Scandinavian parliaments. The althing, in particular, continues today in Iceland as the world's oldest surviving legislative body. The voices are now digital, the laws written. But the bones remain. So, when that man steps off the boat, carrying stories and goods, he walks not into chaos, but into a world with rules, harsh, imperfect, but structured. Even at the edges of the world, Viking law remembered. The tent flaps gently in the coastal breeze. Inside, 3 chieftains sit on sealskin cushions, sipping fermented milk and watching a boy carry in a carved wooden box. Inside the box, bones, runed sticks, carved tokens. The evidence. Because Viking law wasn't all about sword fights and shouted accusations. Sometimes it was about proof, however strange or sacred. Evidence, in the Viking world, could come in many forms: oaths, witnesses, sacred relics. Even the way a man held his hands while speaking could affect how his words were weighed. But it all started with the oath. To accuse someone or defend oneself, one had to swear a formal statement, usually invoking the gods: Odin, Thor, Freya. Breaking such an oath wasn't just lying, it was soul-deep perjury. It risked both outlawry and divine punishment. An accuser who swore falsely could be ruined. An accused who swore truthfully and had witnesses might walk free. In the absence of physical evidence, the oath ring was used, a sacred object often placed on an altar or held by a priest. The accused placed a hand upon it and spoke the truth, calling down the gods to punish him if he lied. One famous tale describes a chieftain who, instead of swearing on the usual bronze ring, demanded to swear on his family's wolf-bone ring, said to be cursed. When the court accepted, the accuser withdrew his claim. No one wanted to challenge a man who trusted a cursed oath. And that was part of the point. Evidence in Viking courts wasn't just about fact, it was about faith, belief. The community had to believe that the accused was telling the truth, or that the accuser had grounds. Witnesses were essential. For land disputes, boundary disagreements, thefts, they carried the burden of memory, and their social standing mattered. A respected elder's word weighed more than a reckless youth's, but witnesses weren't always easy to find. One peculiar rule allowed an accused person to clear themselves if they could gather a certain number of oath helpers, people willing to swear that they believed in the person's innocence. Not that they knew, just that they believed. A popularity contest, dressed up in legal robes. Historians still debate whether this practice helped truth emerge or simply rewarded charisma and fear. In communities where everyone knew everyone, how could justice be impartial? And yet, it often worked. Viking Law prized public knowledge. Cases were discussed, stories shared. Reputation was everything. A man known for stealing sheep might find no one willing to swear for him, even if he didn't steal this time. A woman known for honesty might win a case on testimony alone. One odd case tells of a man who brought a raven as his witness, claiming it had seen his neighbor break into his house. The court laughed, but asked for the neighbor's side. The neighbor confessed. Turns out, the raven was just a prop, but the lie smoked out the truth. Physical evidence existed too, but was rare. A broken lock, a bloodied knife, a footprint. But there were no forensic teams, no sealed bags or court photographers. Most evidence was handled by the community. If a body was found, the closest freemen would inspect it, then swear publicly on what they saw. One ancient law in Sweden stated that if a corpse was found on a man's property, the owner had to produce either a known suspect or 3 witnesses who could confirm he wasn't responsible. Failing that, he could be fined, or worse. The presence of a body wasn't just tragedy. It was legal weight. And the thing listened carefully. Decisions turned on these strange proofs, on how convincingly a man spoke, how many supporters he brought, how well his story held under questioning. Judges didn't always ask for consistency. They asked for honor. One saga speaks of a woman who, accused of theft, presented a poem instead of an oath. In the poem, she described her innocence so beautifully that the court, enchanted, dismissed the charge. No rule for bad poetry. So it worked, law as rhythm, justice as story. Through all of this, the idea was simple. The law existed not just to punish, but to balance, to restore harmony through structure, to give the community a voice, and to remind even the most powerful that truth, in the end, had weight. And sometimes that weight was carried in bones, words, or a well-timed raven. A ship approaches the shore, its sail low and tattered. On board, the crew sings no songs, they carry no trade goods. This voyage isn't about silver or glory, it's about justice. They bring a body. The dead, in Viking law, did not vanish quietly. The law gave them weight, presence, even a voice. And sometimes, the dead were the ones who began the trial. Funeral customs across the Norse world were complex and symbolic, but they were also legal. A man killed without just cause, without compensation, without confession, his body could spark a case just by existing. If found, the corpse became the center of attention. Witnesses were called. Community members gathered. In Iceland, a curious legal ritual called the corpse summons took place. The victim's kin would stand beside the body, point toward the accused, and speak a formal declaration naming the killer and demanding justice. It was raw, ripping, often public. The ritual was believed to call the dead to testify in spirit binding the court, the accused, and even the gods to truth. It wasn't ghostly nonsense. It was legally binding. One case tells of a man whose brother was found in a stream, strangled. The family performed the corpse summons in front of a gathering crowd, naming a rival neighbor. That man denied it, but the thing ruled against him. Anyway, swayed by the ritual, the testimony, and his poor reputation, he was outlawed, his house abandoned. Years later, it burned in a storm. Some called it justice. Others whispered about the brother's ghost. Historians still debate how widespread corpse summons were ritual or rare exception. But legal records and sagas confirm they happened and that courts took them seriously. In a world where evidence was fragile and reputation was everything, death was the most serious accusation of all. And it didn't stop there. Burials themselves had legal weight. Land could not be sold if a man was buried there. His presence claimed the soil. This gave families power over ancestral property. Disputes sometimes arose over whether bones had truly been interred or merely scattered to fake a claim. One strange tale involves a man who faked a grave using a pig's skull and goat bones, claiming his father lay beneath the soil. When the court demanded exhumation, the deception was discovered. He was fined for fraud, and the bones reburied properly for decency. Not all deaths led to trials, but unexpected ones, murders, accidents, suspicious drownings often triggered investigation. And even when no one was charged, the law demanded closure, a proper burial, a public farewell, a line drawn between the living and the dead. Without that, spirits might linger. Or worse, so might questions. One account from the Faroe Islands tells of a body buried at sea without ceremony. Months later, the village suffered drought and illness. The people believed the dead man had been wronged. A new ceremony was held, his name cleared publicly, and the trouble stopped. Coincidence or conscience? The law didn't care. The people did. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about healing the wound left by violence. That's why blood money existed. That's why corpse rituals mattered. The law acted as salve and sword. In rare cases, the accused offered self-exile, admitting guilt, offering compensation, then departing forever. This was considered noble. A man who confessed and paid might save his family's honor. A man who denied, fought, or fled could stain his kin for generations. One poetic tale tells of a man who, after killing a neighbor in a drunken fight, walked to the victim's house the next morning, offered his sword to the widow, and asked her to name his price. She took the sword and gave him her son to raise. That child grew up to become a law speaker. Even in the face of death, the law sought order, and behind every verdict, every fine, every sentence, stood the whisper of the dead. Not haunting, but remembering. The Vikings didn't believe the dead were gone. They believed the past walked beside the present. And so their laws reflected that. No one was truly silent, not even the fallen. The snows melt early this year. In the hills above the fjord, the roads turn to mud. A lone figure walks, cloaked in black, head down, not from shame, but from necessity. He is an outlaw, not just a criminal, not just a fugitive. In Viking law, outlawry was worse than death. It was erasure, a legal vanishing. A man declared utlagger was cast outside the protection of society. Anyone could kill him without consequence. No one could feed him. No one could shelter him. His name, for legal purposes, ceased to exist. But even in this, the law was precise. Outlawry came in two forms: Full outlawry, or skagang, forest going, was permanent. The man was banished forever, a shadow among trees. The second, lesser outlawry, lasted for 3 years. If the man survived, he could return and reclaim his place. If he didn't, no one mourned that the thing didn't hand out outlawry casually. It was reserved for serious offenses: murder, repeated theft, oath-breaking, rape. But in some cases even, minor crimes, if compounded by dishonor, could lead to banishment. One peculiar case from early Iceland involved a farmer who slaughtered a neighbor's prized goat out of spite. The goat wasn't just livestock, it had been trained to dance. At weddings, the act, while petty, was considered deeply dishonorable. The farmer refused to apologize. The thing declared him outlawed for 3 winters. He survived in the mountains by trapping foxes and was eventually allowed to return, though the goat's name was carved into a local law stone as a lesson. Strange, but effective. Historians still debate whether outlawry was meant to punish or to protect. Some suggest it gave communities a bloodless way to deal with dangerous men. Others see it as a silent death sentence, especially in winter. Either way, being outlawed was a fate feared by all. The law had rituals for this too. At the thing, the law speaker would recite the outlaw's name 3 times, then declare him beyond the law. His property was seized, his marriage dissolved. His children could not inherit. His home was marked with a black post driven into the earth. In some regions, that post was burned. In others, it stood for years, a grim reminder of the line no one should cross. But not all outlaws vanished. Some became legends, ghost-like figures who survived in the wild, appearing at night to steal food or leave warnings. One saga tells of an outlaw who carved his verdict into a cliff face. "I still breathe. That is enough." His name lost, but the cliff remains. Some outlawed men found new communities. In Greenland, Icelandic outlaws sometimes took refuge among settlers far from the reach of the Althing. Others joined raiding crews, becoming pirates. A few, in rare twists, earned forgiveness through heroic deeds. One such man saved a village from a winter avalanche by cutting a new drainage path for the snow. He was reaccepted the following spring. The boulder he moved is still shown to travelers. Still, most did not return. Some outlawed men took their fates into their own hands, challenging rivals to final duels, surrendering to vengeance, or simply walking into the sea. One story tells of a young man who asked to be outlawed instead of executed, believing he could survive the forest. He lasted 6 weeks. His bones were found beside a carved message. The law was right. The law could be cruel, but it was consistent. Outlawry had one more twist. It could be inherited. A father outlawed could doom his sons unless they could prove themselves loyal to the law. In these cases, young men sometimes appeared at the thing with nothing but a sheep and a story, begging to be heard. One was granted a chance to fight in the king's army as redemption. He returned 5 years later a decorated warrior. His father's name remained erased, but his was entered anew. The Vikings lived in a world where belonging mattered, where community meant survival, and outlawry, that was the worst punishment, because it wasn't pain. It was isolation, not death by axe, but death by silence. The hall is full tonight. Firelight dances across the timber beams as voices rise, not in anger, but in argument. The thing is in session, and the verdict will shape more than just one life. Because in Viking law, when the case was too big, too tangled, too dangerous, the court turned to a higher ritual. Compensation, wergild, or man price, wasn't just blood money. It was the glue that held society together. A way to balance pain with payment, grief with gold. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but finality. The logic was clear. Every person had a value, not in the modern sense of human rights, but as part of a social contract. A chieftain's death might cost 100 head of cattle. A freeman, 12 ounces of silver. A thrall, often just the market rate, harsh, unequal, but structured. This structure allowed grief to end. A family received payment, often public and ceremonial, and in exchange, the feud stopped. At least in theory, but it wasn't always easy. Sometimes the guilty refused to pay. Sometimes the victim's family rejected the offer, demanding blood instead of silver. And sometimes no one could agree on the value of a life. One famous saga recounts a trial where the accused offered payment not in silver but in poetry. He composed 20 verses praising the dead man's strength, courage, and generosity. The family, moved by the verses, accepted. The court, confused, but the precedent was set. Historians still debate how flexible the wergild system truly was. Some claim it created peace in an otherwise brutal world. Others argue it cemented inequality, giving wealthy men a way to buy their way out of justice. They're both probably right. Still, the idea that a wrong could be measured and repaired was central to Viking law. It showed that beneath the violence there was negotiation. Beneath the steel, structure. Even the church adopted the concept. As Christianity spread, wergild was folded into penance. A man might pay a fine, say 100 prayers, and build a chapel. In the eyes of God and the law, that could settle the matter. One unusual case tells of a man who accidentally killed a priest's goat during a hunting trip. The priest demanded 3 silver coins. The hunter, poor but proud, offered instead to carve a new altar for the village church. It was accepted, and the altar stood for 200 years. Not all payments were material. Sometimes, marriage served as compensation. A daughter offered to unite feuding families, or a son promised to foster a child from the other clan. These weren't just social ties, they were legal acts, binding in public. In some rare cases, communities paid wergild on behalf of their own members. A popular man, facing ruin for an accidental killing, might receive help from neighbors. They would each donate a little silver. In return, he owed the village years of service repairing boats, herding cattle, or building homes. That debt became its own kind of law. But when compensation failed, when no agreement could be reached, then the case escalated, either to outlawry or to duel, or worse, to vendetta. That was the danger wergild was meant to prevent. And so, Viking courts did everything they could to push for settlement. They delayed verdicts, assigned neutral mediators, held public feasts before final rulings, hoping the ale might soften tempers. Sometimes it worked. One saga tells of a young man who, rather than pay a fine for killing a rival, offered to care for the dead man's aging father. The old man, initially enraged, came to accept the offer. The two lived under the same roof for 7 winters. The court approved it as valid compensation, and when the old man died, he named his caretaker as son. Law made kin out of enemies. Still, there were limits. Worgeld could not cover every crime. Certain offenses, rape, oath-breaking, sorcery, often fell outside its reach. In these cases, outlawry or execution was more common. But for most matters, especially manslaughter and personal injury, compensation was the goal. Even insults had prices. Calling a man a coward in public? That could cost a sheep. Accusing a woman of infidelity? That might bring a fine or a slap if she was particularly bold. There are records of insults being priced by how many people heard them and how loudly they were spoken. Words had weight. In the end, Viking compensation law wasn't just about fairness. It was about peace, about putting an end to the cycle, about reminding everyone that even in a cold, violent world, balance could still be struck. A child runs across the field, past the ring of stones where the thing once met. He doesn't know the stories. Not yet. But under his feet lie echoes of laws spoken, oaths sworn, and peace forged not in fire, but in words, because Viking law, at its core, wasn't about domination. It was about continuity, the turning of seasons, the protection of kin, the rhythm of justice. And at the center of it all stood the LAWSPEAKER. An elder, chosen not for strength, but for memory. The law speaker was not a judge in the modern sense. He held no gavel. He passed no sentence. His task was to recite, to remember every law, every precedent, every ruling of the thing. In Iceland, where the Althing met each summer, the law speaker stood upon the law rock and recited 1/3 of the law each year. No paper, no scroll, just voice. The entire legal system depended on a single human memory. It seems impossible. And yet, it worked. The law speaker was supported by assistants, often young boys chosen for sharp minds. Over time, laws were passed down orally, refined, reinterpreted. And when contradictions arose, it was the community, not the king, that decided. One famous story tells of a law speaker who forgot a key ruling during a land dispute. The case stalled for hours. Then a blind shepherd spoke up from the back of the crowd, repeating the lost ruling word for word. The court approved it. The law speaker thanked him with a goat. Sometimes, justice wears simple shoes. Historians still debate whether these oral codes were more flexible or more vulnerable to manipulation. Some claim the system allowed for dynamic, community-driven law. Others point out how easily a powerful man could twist words to suit his aims, and yet the thing remained a place of balance. It wasn't democracy as we know it. Not everyone could vote, but it was participatory. Every freeman had a voice. Disputes were aired in public. No whispers in marble halls. No closed chambers. Decisions were collective. Even kings, where they existed, were often bound by the decisions of the thing. In Norway, it wasn't until the late 11th century that royal authority began to override local law completely. Before that, kings sought consent from the law assemblies. They ruled, but they negotiated. One tale from Sweden describes a king who attempted to impose a new tax without approval. The thing declared him too greedy for the gods and exiled him. His son later returned, swearing never to act without counsel. The people welcomed him. The tax was forgotten. In some ways, Viking law was ahead of its time. It valued public knowledge. It believed in reputation. It allowed for second chances through compensation, exile, even forgiveness. It made space for women, for freed slaves, For those without titles, but with truth on their side. And at its best, it turned violence into dialogue. That was the true genius of the thing, not the stones, not the rituals, but the talking, the idea that words slow, careful, witnessed words could shape a world just as much as swords. One saga ends with an old woman sitting near the fire, telling her grandchildren how their family once won a court case with a single speech, not with a sword, she says, with a sentence, no battles, just balance. And that's where it all rests. In a world of raids and revenge, Viking law offered something remarkable, a chance to stop, to speak, to weigh justice not by wrath, but by reason. It was not perfect, but it was trying. And in that trying, it built something rare. A system not only for the living, but for the generations to come. The fire has dimmed. The voices have softened. The last story has been told. In the world of the Vikings, where blades once ruled and wind carried ships across cold seas, a quieter force held their society together, the law. Not law as a cage, but law as a thread tying people to land, to memory, to each other. From inheritance customs to outlawry, from corpse summons to compensation, Viking justice wrapped itself in rituals and oaths, strange tokens and sacred speech. It was a world where a goat could cause a trial, where a poem might pay a debt, and where the dead could still accuse the living. But beneath the oddities and the violence, there was structure. There was effort. There was a people trying to find order in a world ruled by nature and need. They didn't always succeed, but they tried, and that trying echoed through assemblies, across fjords, down into the bones of the very stones they gathered around. Even now, some of those ancient thing sites remain. Quiet fields, half-buried rings, places where once, in the cool northern wind, someone stood tall and spoke the law. And so, with the last word spoken, the hall empty, the snow settling on the paths home, let silence take its place.